Nikon AF-P DX 70-300mm f4.5 to 6.3G ED VR Retro Review. Is this a good enough lens to buy today? Build quality and features. This lens is very basic without switches, but it's solid and I'm confident that it can last quite a few years. The advantage of this lens is that it's very small. Compared to my Nikon 500mm f5.6 PF lens, which is 1.5 kilograms, this one is just 415 grams. Super light. It's also very short at 17.7 centimeters, so it's an easy thing to throw in your bag. The main feature of this lens is the quiet AF-P pulse motor. It makes this lens very quick to focus, and I'd say it's even faster than my 500mm f5.6 PF lens, probably because the lens elements are so light. Just make sure that if you're using this lens on a Nikon DSLR, that it supports the AF-P protocol. Some of the older models do not. Finally, this lens has a vibration reduction or VR mechanism, and it's rated to 4 stops. That should be plenty at this short focal length. The only downside about the build is that this lens does not have a rubber ring on the back, and it is not stated to be weather sealed. It has a plastic mount, so the seal with the camera is okay, but I would not use this lens in moderate rains or snow. Use cases. The main use case of this lens is if you want a mid-range zoom on either an F-mount or a Z-mount camera. You can actually get it used right now for about $300, which is pretty cheap compared to some of the more modern lenses, especially the newer ones for the Z-mount. If you're using a smaller DX camera like the Nikon Z52, then this older F-mount lens could be an alternative to some of the newer lenses if you already have an FTZ adapter. Or if you're using a DSLR like the Nikon D500, this would also be a great lens to have. I've used it on the Nikon Z6 as well in crop mode, and even though it only gives me about 12 megapixels, it's really quite still handy when I don't want to carry around my bigger lens. Image quality. Alright, now we get into the good stuff, the performance in terms of image quality. I'd say the image quality is pretty decent, but not great, as expected. Let's first look at sharpness. Overall, I'd rate this lens a 3 out of 5 on my personal sharpness scale. It's decent, but not outstanding. Here are some shots to show you how it can perform. The first is a social flycatcher, uncropped. Let's zoom into 100%. Yeah, we're still getting a decent amount of feather detail here. And here's a rufous-bellied thrush, which you can see is slightly cropped. Again, good feather detail. Here's another shot at 240mm at f6. If I zoom in here, you can see a bit of softness that definitely would not be present with a better lens. At normal viewing sizes though, it's not a huge problem. The lens gets a bit of a sharpness boost when stopped down as well, but not much. Now let's look at bokeh. Actually, I like the bokeh of the lens a lot. The 7 rounded blades do a good job. You can see in this shot of a nest of a rufous hornero, the bokeh circles are round even when stopped down to f7.1, but you can see some color fringing in them. Actually, in my opinion, the biggest defect of this lens is the high amount of chromatic aberrations. It's pretty strong. Basically, when you're shooting against bright light sources, you'll very likely notice some chromatic aberrations, like in this shot we already looked at. Look at the plumes of the heron. The blue fringing is incredibly strong. Yes, you can remove it in post, but keep in mind that in harsh lighting, fringing does reduce image quality around the fringes, so that it's something to keep in mind. I'd say that most of the time, the fringing doesn't get in the way too much in practice though. Another potential downside of this lens is its maximum aperture at 300mm, which is f6.3. That's pretty dim for wildlife at 300mm, so if you have to crop a little, which is likely at 300mm for birds at least, you'll start to see noise pretty quickly. Of course, that's the trade-off you get, for the lens is lightweight. Use for bird photography. As you've seen, the Nikon 70-300mm AF-P DX lens is a pretty decent lens. It's not a performance breaker, but the quality is fine. It should produce very decent images when you can actually get close enough, and that's the true problem you'll face. The actual lens performance is much less important than the focal length. After all, 300mm is quite short for birds. Now, it worked pretty well for me when I could get close enough, and in those cases I think most people would be pretty happy with it. But in the wild, 300mm will almost never be close enough for smaller birds. For example, here's one of my favorite shots taken with a 500mm lens, the Nikon 500mm f5.6 PF. This shot was in the wild, far away from urban parks. It's a woodpecker that was over 12 meters away, and it's a shot that works very well at 500mm, but it wouldn't work at all with the 70-300 that we're talking about. So, keep that in mind. Also, since this lens is not razor sharp, you won't be able to crop as much as you would be able to with a higher end 300mm prime. Conclusion. I like the Nikon 70-300mm f4.5 to 6.3 lens. It's a decent lens to have, especially if 70mm to 300mm is not really a focal length range you use too often, but you still want something shorter for larger animals, landscapes, and people. Yes, there are better lenses out there, but for around $300 is a great budget option as long as what you're photographing is really suited to at most 300mm. That's it. I hope this review helped you decide whether this lens is right for you, but if it didn't, eat some cherry ice cream.